Hey, cadre, and it's a two-parter because my battery died, and this would have been up quicker, but I couldn't find my backup battery, and so I had to do the good old charging thing. Anyways, we're detracting from the message, which is Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, or the hashtag Martin Luther Reverend Dr. Jr. Day. Okay, so where were we? I was almost done with the alternet.org list of 9, what did they say? 9 MLK quotes the mainstream media won't cite. Okay. Their subline here is, the words of the real MLK were far more radical than today's cherry-picked lines. Alright, we're in the middle of the last one. And this next source might have some of the same quotes. I think I'll just repeat them since these are now separate videos. If you're watching them both in order like a loyal follower, then I apologize, but man, these are good and they're pretty dense, so I hope they just spur more thought. Maybe something new will come to mind. So, and I quote, "First, I must confess that over the past few years I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom, is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection." This was from 1963, letter from a Birmingham jail. I don't know who that letter was addressed to, but I'm guessing that was private correspondence that must have later been published. But this expresses even back then that Martin Luther King sensed this pushback from the bulk of the citizenry as almost more frustrating than the extremists, and possibly spinning in his grave at the situation we put ourselves in now. I guess I'll point out that this list was compiled by Callie Holloway, that alternate. And now let's move on to 10 Martin Luther King Jr. quotes the government wants you to forget. And this is posted on the antimedia.org. Yeah, we celebrate his life, but of course we're ignoring. Okay, these are not numbered, they're bulleted. That's fine. "We must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system the way of life, the philosophy which produced the martyrs. That's a quote of his from the Eulogy for the Martyred Children in 1963. The function of education, therefore, is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. But education which stops with efficiency may prove the greatest menace to society. The most dangerous criminal may be the man gifted with reason but with no morals. From 1947, The Purpose of Education. Interesting. So even before the civil rights movement really got its feet, he was understanding that a problem, lack of intensity in the education system could prove a great menace to society, and that morals must be part of it. And that is not to say religion. Morality and religion are not tied, and that's another video I need to make soon. Alright, moving on. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and save war. This way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching a spiritual death. This from Why I'm Opposed to the War in Vietnam in 1967, and we heard the last sentence, but it's interesting to hear the rest of it. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Feel free to rewind the video if you want to reprocess. Moving on. The hope of a secure and livable world lies with disciplined nonconformists who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood. The trailblazers in human, academic, scientific, and religious freedom have always been nonconformists. In any cause that concerns the progress of mankind, put your faith in the nonconformist. From Strength to Love, 1963. Jeez, man. As a freak of the world, I embrace this quote wholeheartedly. And do you conform? Do you conform to the norm? Seriously? It's hard for me to believe that even 50% of us conform to the norms. I mean, we're each within our own family sometimes led to believe we're outsiders. All right, these are asides from Sattva Pran, but let's move on. The Drood, sorry. Asides from the Drood. The Drood asides. What can I say? Moving on. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? From his letter from a Birmingham City jail, 1963. That's another one that cuts to the heart of something we still haven't dealt with. Even the word extremist has been thrown into this category of bad. And Isn't an extremist for love good? An extremist for non-violence? An extremist for justice? An extremist for the Constitution? Urgh. For America? What do we mean when we say America? When I say America, I mean the founding principles that led us to be a great country and ideal. And we've been pulled slowly away from that. The American dream of reaching success from nothing, lifting ourselves up by our bootstraps. This was a great binding principle of Americans at one point, and it's been lost as the middle class has been just squeezed into poverty over time, and the 1% has risen to take more and more power, and through the lobbyists and there are laws in place that would protect us from this if they were implemented, if they were still perceived in the same light. All right, moving on. Next quote from the great king. Men often hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they cannot communicate. They cannot communicate because they are separated. From 1958, Stride Toward Freedom. Mother fracker. That's another one that cuts right to the heart of what we're dealing with now. Men hate because of fear because they don't know each other, because they can't communicate, because they are separated. And we are not only still incredibly separated physically and geographically by race, which we now claim is by choice, but in fact it's forced by economic status. And we conflate economics with race. If you point at a largely black neighborhood, the politicians will say, no, that's a largely poor neighborhood. And in fact, I've witnessed mind-blowing reversals, like during the Flint water crisis, there were poor white people standing up, crying for the suffering of the poor, and being silenced by black policemen physically through threat of violence or incarceration, stripping of freedom. They've been, cast out of, and this was in a religious institution. Why a town hall was being held in a religious institution, and then that the politicians would be pointing towards the morals of the religion to silence poor people who really, what words do they have to turn for to express the overwhelming feelings? Okay. Moving on. There's just one more to get through. Violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. It leaves society on monologue rather than dialogue. Violence ends by defeating itself. It creates bitterness in the survivors and brutality in the destroyers. from his Nobel lecture, The Quest for Peace and Justice, in 1964. And again, that's another powerful and dense one. I think I'll repeat it. Violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. It leaves society in monologue rather than dialogue. Violence ends by defeating itself. It creates bitterness in the survivors and brutality in the destroyers. Yeah, and what I meant to mention in after the last one that I think is important and relates to this one, especially the monologue rather than dialogue, is even now online, which should be a great bastion of communication and access to knowledge. A lot of us have looked to the internet as being a tool for the future that would lead to the spread of information, which will lead to contemplation, analysis, judgment, a better understanding of the complexity of the issues we're dealing with. And even now on this great system, we're getting this separation, this segregation of ideas through Facebook filtering us based on our own proclivities. And even Google does this too with their searches. If you sit a liberal down next to a conservative, next to a moderate, and have them each search, say, the same locale, like Egypt, you'll get very different results for people on the left, the right, and the center. You'll get things that reinforce the liberal perspective for the leftist, and you'll get things that reinforce the conservative perspective for the guy that searches, the Republican that searches the same term, and the moderate may very well get results, best places to travel or something, and be clueless to either of the two sides that are occurring. And this increases extremism because it creates these echo chambers where people just can spiral out of control within their own specific perspective. Just to throw myself in here at the end, I am not interested in my own perspective. It is unique, and I feel compelled to compare it, but I do not expect any of you to adopt it or to follow it blindly or without question. If you like the cut of my jib or the style of my suspenders, feel free to subscribe, like, comment. Any increased activity will help bring attention to the channel, which will spread the ideas further. Feel free to share and like. I used to be a self-walling. I'm already spiraling into my thoughts, and when that happens, I start to feel the pressures of other realms. So I'm going to end it there. But yeah, join the club if you want to, if you aren't already. Otherwise, it was a pleasure sharing some of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day quotes with you. Insert catchphrase here.